Welcome to Windows Millennium for the Enterprise. My name is Raymond Dusso. ThinApp implementation and design best practices. I've delivered this the last couple of years at VMworld. Any previous attendees? I got like half. Awesome. So the material was getting pretty solid, but this year I actually decided to mix it up a bit. So I'm focused on a lot of the stuff that nobody talks about, storage and networking, and there's actually a security piece in the middle that is important, and I'm starting to get hit with these kinds of questions. So I'm hoping that the material isn't too out there, but I think if anything, let's just start talking about it and discussing these types of design considerations, because ultimately the goal is to be the trusted advisor. The goal is to make the customers happy, and sometimes it's the questions they don't know to ask. So I think for me, I've been trying to explore those types of scenarios. And it's not just all about the bread and butter apps like the Firefoxes and stuff like this. We're really starting to push the limits with what ThinApp can do. I was just told last night that we're on the cusp of actually starting to say out loud that server applications are ready to go. So, a couple of years ago, I had someone ask me, well, can we do SQL Server? And my answer was, yes, we can. Is there a business reason? Maybe not. But we ThinApped it and ran it on Windows XP. So we're really starting to push the limits with what ThinApp can do. So this session is going to try to start scratching the surface with that. I'd like to spend about a half an hour talking about the disclaimer and let it rain because it's raining. Really lengthy agenda. Obviously best practices for both design and implementation. I really want there to be enough QA at the end, so I think I've timed this so that there'll be about 10 minutes, but give or take if I get a little verbose. So one thing that I've been working on the last couple of years is a lot of people, when they're talking about ThinApp and they're selling ThinApp, because the two are starting to blend, they're still selling and talking about features. So what I want to try and position is ThinApp as a solution that fits into View and Horizon and now Mirage, this EUC play. So for me, ThinApp as a solution, there's a process where at first you're documenting customer pain points. Honestly, one of the silliest things I deal with is when I'm training consultants and partners, they don't listen to the customer. They'll ask a question and not wait for the response. They'll just plow right into, well, you need IE6 on Windows 7. You need Java. You need this. But that's not what the customer said. So again, I say this every year, but I feel like I have to keep saying it because it keeps getting missed. So just as the trusted advisor, sometimes listening is the most important thing as opposed to just communicating information. So again, I hate to keep saying this, but it seems like people confuse themselves because this ThinApp is easy until it becomes difficult. And I hear that a lot. So assessments. I asked this in my other session. How many people do application assessments or some sort of assessment before they start projects? I got 4 hands. This is something, and I'm not going to start yelling at you, but this is something that we really feel strongly about, that if you get information, quality information about the customer's environment up front, you can make much better decisions to make the engagement more successful. Applications, in this case, is critical to essentially, rather than take 1,000 apps and just start packaging them randomly, you prioritize them into low, medium, and high complexity applications, which is some methodology that I created, and we're embedding in some IP created by VMware, which then ties to third-party tools like Liquidware Labs, where their tool will collect information about these applications and then categorize them using our methodology, so that you hand the customer a report that says, okay, here's your 1,000 applications, and we've broken them down into low, medium, and high complexity. That way, the high complexity, the most difficult, maybe we push those towards the end, unless you tell me specifically, these are your biggest pain points. Otherwise, you can then move into the low and medium, and now you're handling those with the ThinApp Factory. So again, you're right away providing them real-world information, solid data with which to make the project more successful, rather than just pick an app, start ThinApping, and hope for the best. So again, after the assessment, target application lists, working with the customer to say, okay, you handed me a list of 1,000 apps, I used a tool, this list is completely different than the list you gave me. How is that possible? Sort of irrelevant. Now I've handed you a list. Now let's talk through the list. Which are your priority apps? Oh, I didn't know I used that one. I didn't know that 2,000 users had this version of that app. So again, it's now you're uncovering those true pain points as opposed to what they think their pain points are. It's all about accurate data to provide that information to customers. Now you get into the capture and build process, which is what I'm finding is a lot of customers that have internal packaging teams, it seems like they all do it differently. So it's not our job to try and tell them how to change. Sometimes it comes down to subtle changes. And the ThinApp Factory, how many people know what the ThinApp Factory is? Perfect. Anybody seen a demo or it's available for a fling? Hopefully you all are aware of that. We're really excited about the ThinApp Factory. One, that it's free. Two, that you can inject it into a customer's existing packaging process and not disrupt a lot. Whereas some tools tend to be very disruptive and cause processes to just go awry. So again, it subtly injects into their existing process. And again, right there, again, 1,000 applications for a customer. So, what if the ThinApp Factory could be 50% successful and take 500 of those applications off the table and convert them to ThinApp packages in the background? That is a big number, and that is some tremendous ROI, and immediately you're gaining trusted advisor status with the customer. That makes the conversation go that much smoother. At which point you then migrate into deployment methodology as part of the discussion. And again, this is just a short list of some of the tools that ThinApp can easily integrate with. To this day, I've yet to find one that a ThinApp EXE or MSI can't integrate with. So again, that's a powerful message. I told the story the other day that I had a customer that had Alteryx, and I was in front of them primarily because they couldn't stand Alteryx. They were sick of it. They wanted to spend thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars ripping it out and replacing it with one of these other tools. After a couple of days, ThinApp was able to alleviate some of the stress on the tool and their issues so that they were able to salvage that relationship with the tool and to gain momentum and actually use it to its fullest extent. So sometimes it's about ultimately helping the customers and not necessarily positioning them in one way. But that was a very interesting solution where the customer, the light bulb went off and said, oh, so there's a resolution to these 50% failures across some of their native installs with this Alteryx packages. It's very powerful stuff. Again, integration with Vue, very important. And now Horizon App Manager. How many people are using or talking about Horizon App Manager at this point? 3 people. Okay, it's probably not good. Probably should be more. Just saying, throwing that out there. So again, looking at it, here's just I'm going to skip over these, but looking at the, this is just an additional breakdown with some of the, we are working with tools like Liquidware Labs and Changebase and Flexera from an assessment perspective. I think another interesting point is the idea of, I was just asked this the other day. If a customer packages their own MSIs, does ThinApp have to replace their MSI solution? And the answer is no. You know, it's a catch-22 whether you come in and just replace that. So I think the two work very well together to, you know, take vendor EXEs or MSIs and then rebrand them, repackage them to their customizations that they want, and then ThinApp takes that last step and wraps that as a ThinApp package for ultimate deployment. All right, so let's talk some storage observations. Again, I've been hesitant the last couple of years, so I'm the one that's writing a lot of the IP around ThinApp best practices in a lot of the guides. But because we don't own storage, I've been very hesitant to make bold claims about performance and scalability, primarily because I can't be in every customer's environment, and up until just recently, the storage vendors didn't really understand what I was asking for, as far as we need to talk about application performance sitting on your disk. I'm excited to tell you that, you know, EMC and NetApp and Nexenta, they're now starting to buy into this, that a VMDK or a VM on storage gets different performance than an application sitting on storage. So there is subtle differences there, and we can start to really document that. So again, one quick item is DFS, Microsoft DFS tends to be, across my survey of, you know, most PSO consultants and some partners, DFS tends to be the solution of choice amongst enterprises. However, here's the bad news. What we're finding is, and immediately if there's performance issues, they try to blame ThinApp. Well, ThinApp is blocking this, ThinApp is, you know, it doesn't work on Tuesdays, whatever it is. I mean, I've heard it all. What we're finding is that improper configuration of DFS zones ends up causing those delays. So instead of going from here to there, it's going from here to Singapore and back and then over here. So again, it's the misconfiguration of these zones. But again, from my perspective, I've been remiss to try and, you know, write a document that says, here's how you set up DFS for ThinApp. The decision has been made up until just recently to basically point back to Microsoft's site and said, look, they have best practices, please follow them. But even that wasn't working. So what you're going to start to find in our documentation is little snippets about how to configure some of these solutions in our guidance, and DFS being one of them, obviously EMC. We're starting to build a better, stronger relationship with the V specialist team as far as testing in their labs. So ultimately, this kind of recommendation, I would love to be on EMC paper, but it's just been slow going because obviously ThinApp is just one piece of the EUC equation. One thing that we've been discussing lately is read and write IOPS. But again, there's subtle differences between IOPS as well. So it's disk reads and call requests over the network. So there's two components to that. So from a storage perspective, it's really those disk reads that are the trick there. And a lot of people had some misconceptions. Well, it's just a flat file sitting on disk. There really isn't a challenge. So, but again, then they come back to me and they say, well, how many ThinApp packages can I put on this storage spindle or this array? And there really is no way to answer that without testing. And by the time they've asked me this, the project is halfway done. So I'm starting to encroach on the ability to provide loose best practices on some of these basic recommendations across a couple of different vendors. So you're going to start to see that soon. But again, these are some basic best practices where heavy read and write. So in some respects, ThinApp packages require faster disk than even the VM. And that's one of those things that we're starting to see to gain performance. Office 2010. How many people are trying to ThinApp Office 2010? Okay. So there's a lot of misconceptions around this. And Office 2010 tends to be a very polarizing event or concept. And so I'm here to tell you that my findings, my research, point to the fact that Office 2010 as a ThinApp package is a best practice. However, I feel that it should be part of the base image. And that's a slight change from the idea of streaming it off a network share. So here's a couple of different points. One, Office, like most applications, has a very ugly uninstall. So as you're manipulating parent VMs and updates and that sort of thing, the idea of having to uninstall Office or make updates or changes becomes a little clunky. So by leveraging a ThinApp package, you immediately have that quick remove capability to replace and change. Secondly, we've discovered through various testing that Office 2010, unlike some of the other Office versions, on the surface it seems very performant. Quick launches, the application itself or the various components are running pretty quick overall. However, how they're achieving that is through the use of services that are left running, hidden services left running in the background. And so when ThinApp decouples these, we start to see those subtle differences. And when you stream these apps, as you would with ThinApp, we're seeing ranges of 200 meg at first launch and 700 meg at second launch coming across the wire just to produce the runtime based on these hidden services in the background. So it's not that I'm not trying to lay fault with Office 2010, it's just there's a lot of subtle issues in the background that running it as a ThinApp package locally on the base image addresses. So again, we can talk about that more later. This is one of my favorite lines. I actually had a customer say to me about a year ago, hey, I'm just going to put the ThinApp repository on junk disk and just sit it over there because that's easy. Now, I love the sentiment that it's easy, it's just that doesn't make sense. So as I'm standing in front of the customer and they're complaining to me about performance, I'm asking them things like, well, where does that disk sit? And their answer was, and we're sitting in, let's just call it Arizona, and their answer was, well, it's in some guy's basement in San Francisco over a 56K frame relay line, and the disk is stuff we bought at, a yard sale. So right there, I'm not sure how many problems you could pick up, but it's not exactly the most efficient way to do that. And so, yes, ThinApp packages are easy. They can be run from anywhere. They can be run from a USB stick. However, I'd rather not have them sitting on disk you bought at a yard sale in some guy's basement in San Francisco. I mean, that's just not the way to go. So we need to find the happy medium between, SSD, fast disk, and the scenario I just described. So again, that was one misconception I'd like to put away is, you really start to need to think about where you're putting the ThinApp repository, and there is a case to be made that the fast disk isn't always just to go to your VMs. That I think it's probable and likely that carving out some fast disk, either SSD or high write SATA, is the most efficient use for the ThinApp repository. The next thing we've been testing is automatic tiering storage from vendors like EMC and or NetApp, where you have initial storage on SATA, but at first launch, it is then moved to high capacity, high density SSD to gain that much more performance. So again, we're starting to explore those types of technologies, and we're going to start to actually test with EMC in their data center to then provide that type of information back to you. However, I do explore you to reach out to them on your own as you're exploring POCs, as you're looking at your infrastructure. These are the types of things that are going to make ThinApp packages more performant in your environment. And again, number of connections. I actually was talking to one customer, and they didn't realize it, but the connections to their SAN was being limited by a number of different selections that they had made. And they and that was the block. That was the bottleneck. So immediately bumping those connections alleviated some of that stress. Compression. How many people know that you can compress ThinApp packages? Good. Well, my previous life was spent with SoftGrid and Softricity App V, and compression was a bit clunky. So that soured me to the idea of compression, and because ThinApp streaming was so efficient, I've never necessarily discussed or recommended compression before from a ThinApp perspective. However, based on expensive storage and based on efficiencies and budgets, we're starting to kick the tires around, can ThinApp compression be a benefit on the front end of your designs? Specifically, the way ThinApp compression works is if you have a Firefox package that is 40 meg, 20 meg of that would be, or if it's compressed down to 20 meg, the first launch might only be 10 meg, but that's all you're uncompressing to get that first window, that runtime. So again, we're starting to explore those kinds of capabilities to see if it makes sense to start doing that. Now, what I don't want to have happen is that you turn on compression and you're losing 5 to 6, 10 seconds on the launch. So it's taking 5 to 6 seconds longer, but you're saving disk space on the back end. That's the trade-off. Because again, it's all about what the users see and their user experience. It's a slippery slope. So we're starting to explore those kinds of discussions. But again, these are some of the things that we're looking at to ultimately increase performance for ThinApp packages in your environments. Again, one misconception too is the pod and block design. From a view design perspective, you are aware of this concept, right? The pod and block design. Immediately after that, what I hear is, okay, where do I put the ThinApp repository? And people were including it inside of this pod and block design. However, it was a Windows VM 6 hops away, 10 hops away in the data center. And immediately I'm scratching my head going, okay, well, why not just have it over here on 1 hop away or 2 hops away? And so that immediately is setting up ThinApp streaming for failure as you're further away from the pod and block. Subtle things that will increase performance combined with don't put it on junk disk, these are the types of things that will help in the long run. So network observations. Again, ThinApp streaming, again, has become a very polarizing event. A lot of people love it. A lot of people are frustrated by it because they don't understand it. So the last couple of years I've delivered this session, I focused on and I think you're going to see it in slides in a little bit, where I talk about what ThinApp streaming is. But I think we're starting to find some subtle recommendations that we can make to help you optimize what should be ThinApp streamed and what shouldn't be. And again, you don't have to use it. So that's another misconception, is that people were saying, okay, it's there, I have to use it. It's not necessarily true. We can embed ThinApp packages in the base image. We can, use an MSI. We can, do all kinds of things. There's even things that are coming up from a development standpoint to, different caching mechanisms to try and address this. But again, that becomes a design decision in and of itself, whether or not to use ThinApp streaming, and that is ultimately tied to an assessment. So again, it's all part of this workflow. And again, getting back to the assessment, data collection and assessment capabilities around individual applications and what they will require ultimately for network traffic. At which point, then you can determine how much, what the bottlenecks will be based on the number of applications you're trying to stream. So again, brass tacks, large footprint apps, like a Visual Studio 2008 that can be a ThinApp package. Ultimately, it is a 3 to 4 gig footprint. The initial runtime of that app might be pulling 200 to 500 meg across the wire. That might be the cutoff of 1 gig, perhaps. A 1 gig footprint app and above is not streamed, and 1 gig and below is streamed. I'm not completely convinced that's where the line should be. It's just I'm starting there. I think it's an initial recommendation. We've done some early testing. These are the types of things that we're starting to scratch the surface on as far as, because I've found customers that in smaller environments are finding Visual Studio streaming from the network share works great. But now we're getting into the point where if you try to have 1,000 users doing that, that's where it starts to slow down. So we're trying to find those best practices around where the line is. And because I can't be on site with every customer, we're trying to aggressively scratch the surface and start to accomplish this. So in quickly, ThinApp streaming workload. Again, it's not it's the entire packet is not all ThinApp. So what a misconception that we were finding is that there is TCP/IP overhead on either side of the true ThinApp payload in the middle. So at first double click, what's happening? The call to the network share is happening. The disk read takes place. At which point the data transfer back for that individual runtime, not the entire package. So say Firefox, for example, is a 40 meg package. The runtime might only be 20 meg. 20 meg is all that comes across the wire. At which point the data transfer is complete, the connection to the network share is severed, that runtime is running in memory on the client, and the application is now launched. Again, there's subtle aspects to this where first launch will be quicker, because will be slightly slower based on the sandbox creation, but second launch is generally much faster. So again, there's subtle nuances to this. So again, network basic recommendations. Again, the Office suite, part of the base image based on some rather odd fluctuations in data coming across the wire during the streaming of the various applications. We thought originally it was going to be fairly transparent like most Office apps, but that's where we started to discover a lot of these aspects and various services running hidden in the background that weren't even showing up in Task Manager. It was very odd, some of this capability. Not to say that it's a problem. It's just it was perceived that it was a ThinApp problem. In essence, it was actually the way they architected Office, and we don't own Office. So again, now we're trying to find the best recommendations as to how to deploy Office 2010, and we're starting to scratch the surface with that. As you're doing your assessments and you're collecting data on network recommendations, users, applications, number of ThinApp packages, number of apps to be streamed from ThinApp repository, these are all questions and answers you need as you're starting to design your ThinApp environment as connected to View and/or Horizon. My colleague Mark Ewert and I wrote something called the ThinApp Network Impact Study Guide, and we detailed the testing that you're going to see here. Essentially, our goal is to teach you how to fish. So the idea is from a VM connected to a SAN or some sort of storage, and I'm keeping it generic because we're not trying to tell you what you have to use for this test. It can be any type of SAN. The basic premise is the tool Wireshark, where you're launching a ThinApp package, Word for example, streamed from that share, and you're capturing the conversation and isolating the conversation, and this is a Wireshark feature, isolating that conversation directly to the SAN and monitoring that individual traffic. And at that point, you'll see the TCP/IP overhead and the ThinApp payload, and you'll be able to tell what is the ThinApp payload versus what's the total packet, at which point you'll be able to make calculations based on first and second launch, and ultimately be able to tell what the ThinApp streaming workload is for that application, at which point multiply that by 1,000 users. Now you're able to successfully design, or however many users you want to push through that environment. Now you're able to tell what that footprint is for that app. Then you move on to the next app, and so on and so forth, thus providing actual data rather than just flipping a coin like I find a lot of people do. Or because we don't own all of these applications, it would be very tough for us to test every single application. And so up until now, we haven't really known where to start. But now I think we don't have time to waste anymore, so we're gonna start to test and pick certain applications to then provide data along with teaching you how to fish and build on this so that we can actually design and get a little bit more granular with respect to ThinApp in the environments, especially now that Mirage is in play, Horizon is in play, ThinApp Factory, View. We're really starting to get a cohesive EUC ecosystem where ThinApp and ThinApp Factory are feeding applications to all of those environments. Now is the time we need to start really aggressively going after these design considerations and how many apps and where the bottleneck is for environments. So again, we're starting to kick the tires on IP that would be ThinApp scalability planning guides and all kinds of good information like that, collecting the information from Wireshark. Again, VMware does not want to be in the business of creating these kinds of tools. So there's third-party tools that we're trying to test and work with to provide this data and then spit out these reports for you. So a tool like Liquidware Labs we're starting to see some really good reports come out of this tool that will help you determine not only at a VM level and a desktop level, an application level, as far as network IOPS and hopefully eventually disk IOPS and disk reads and writes. Because that's really the subtle difference to provide that kind of data in which you can design better. Scale. Again, these are straightforward, but again, they're overlooked a lot. So again, it really comes down to IOPS on the disk. Network, network can be tricky as long as you're, from a ThinApp streaming perspective. But again, the disk is really where I feel that our sweet spot is, and it comes down to, avoiding the idea of that junk disk. That's really one thing that we need to stop doing. So again, based on the ThinApp scalability planning data, these are the types of questions that you desperately need to answer. And again, it all comes back to the assessment and collecting that target application list and then prioritizing those apps. Then correlating it to the individual data per those applications. Then you can say, okay, this Firefox, it doesn't require a tremendous ThinApp streaming workload. It should be streaming. Wherever Visual Studio, the data our testing provided, it appears it is pulling a lot of data across the wire. That should not be a candidate for ThinApp streaming. So you're making those decisions based on the data you're collecting in the assessment. Don't be afraid to say no. It feels weird to say this out loud, but a lot of people say to me, well, I have to ThinApp all my applications. And the answer is no. It's absolutely no. It comes down to, does it make business sense? Is it smarter to randomly pick an app and spend 6 weeks trying to package it only to fail? Or does it make more sense to spend a couple of weeks up front doing an assessment with a tool to then find out and then hand the customer or hand yourselves a list of candidates that won't make sense? So what I love doing is up front telling the customer, here are the apps that I can't do, and we're going to just move aside. Now that seems like I'm admitting failure right away, but in essence, I'm actually giving them a trusted advisor answer to basically say, look, you should not be focusing on these right now because of these things. This has print drivers and too many other files, and it's homegrown and it's bulky and it's written oddly. These types of things. We're just going to move those to the side. Not that we're not going to focus on them at some point, but the idea is 70% of apps can more than likely be ThinApped, and that 30%, too many focus on an app in the 30% right at the beginning of one of their projects. And that just, I hear that a lot. So it's all about building success and focusing on the apps that should be candidates as opposed to the apps that should not. And that really comes back to that assessment capability. Okay, security. This is one of those items that nobody ever talks about. I mean, I get asked it quite a bit, but it's always a weird conversation. So today, I'm going to break some rules, and we're going to talk about it. So ThinApp was not designed to be a security encapsulation mechanism. Does everybody understand what I mean when I say that? So everybody understands what intrusion detection is and what McAfee and Symantec and vShield all are trying to do is protect the desktop from viruses. ThinApp was never intended to be a McAfee or an intrusion detection system, or, ThinApp is an isolation mechanism that protects the desktop from the app, and ultimately the app from the desktop. But again, people were confusing that with, oh wow, it will not get viruses. Well, that's not true. If you have a user with a ThinApp package, a Firefox ThinApp package, and they open a virus, that virus is inside the ThinApp package. So again, today I'm going to show you what happened to me at a large enterprise, and I think I'll be able to explain some very clear lines. So again, certain aspects of the product come close. Like, people confuse that isolation with a total wall, a total, unpenetrable wall for viruses. And that's not true. It mostly is true with the combination of AV outside. So a McAfee outside and ThinApp, it's a pretty solid wall, right? So if you're not letting viruses come in, then that's a pretty safe, that's a pretty safe approach. However, if I had a customer the other day said, so does that mean I can pull AV off the desktop? Absolutely not. I mean, it's absolutely not the case. So another recommendation that we've started to approach is embedding security mechanisms inside of ThinApp. So there are certain tools and certain intrusion detection mechanisms or homegrown items that you can embed inside the ThinApp package to explore a concept that we've been looking at, a hardened bubble, a hardened ThinApp package where it's impenetrable, outside and inside. So again, these are all interesting concepts that we're starting to work on. Another fascinating development over the last year is the ThinApp SDK, or the management API, that is readily available for developers, has been taken advantage of by a number of companies. EI and Bitdefender are two companies that have taken that SDK and created technology to essentially scan for viruses and malware inside of the ThinApp package. Very important stuff. This is the next evolution of scanning for viruses and intrusions, now inside of the isolated ThinApp package. Very cool. We're starting to hear about McAfee and Symantec leveraging that. Again, we're also tied into vShield. It's just, I'm not completely convinced that VMware wants to be in the, we're scratching the surface with AV protection. I'm not sure malware and all this other stuff. We really want to, let third-party tools do that. It's very important when working with internal enterprise security teams to stress the concept that I'm not telling you to change anything, because it's a huge misconception. When there's tension there. So as you're talking to and you're working with your internal security teams, they get the immediate impression that, oh wow, you're going to ask me, I'm out of a job, and that is 100% not the case. That's clearly not the case. All right, so what I'm about to describe is what I witnessed at a large enterprise. So a gentleman walks in and has a number of security credentials on lanyards, some very intimidating names like CIA and a number of other credentials. So immediately he had my full attention, started a VM, and launched an Adobe Reader ThinApp package. To my surprise, on the desktop was a file called badfile.pdf. He then proceeds to go file open and opens bad file PDF. I since learned that that was in fact without getting too into it, there are companies that will help you hack stuff for testing. And so they had access to this. It is in fact a virus that opened a portal to a Linux VM somewhere else in their data center. So on the screen, he's got a DOS window that is the prompt from this Linux VM, and he's now tunneled across this tunnel inside of the VFS, and he is deleting files inside the ThinApp package. And now 40 people are looking at me, thinking that I'm going to crack, that I'm going to, and I was a little nervous in my head, but he's literally deleting files. So after about a few minutes, I said, well, that's expected behavior. And he looked at me puzzled, and he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, ThinApp is an isolation mechanism, but it's not stopping the user from doing dumb things. So I'm looking at you as you just opened a virus. The trick, though, is try to delete a file on the host operating system, because all you're doing is breaking the ThinApp package. So the minute he stopped and he tried to go out, browse out to the host operating system and delete files there, he couldn't. So in a nutshell, the bad news is that virus affected the ThinApp package and the isolated VFS. But that's expected behavior. The good news is he was unable to do anything to the host OS. Any questions on that? Because that's actually very important. Perfect. So again, this one slide, to me, now at the end, I think I played it off as, yeah, no problem, and I'm sure I looked okay, but I got back to the hotel last night, and it was just, I was blown away. I was blown away by that raw, hacking a ThinApp package in front of me. It was a very, the outcome was great, but at the same point, it was pure stress in the room. So again, this is a great visual representation of that line. And again, it comes back to the handoff. So the isolation mechanism of ThinApp and the handoff to those intrusion detection and virus protection scanners outside. That's the handoff. We're not telling those don't go away. They're still very much needed to protect the OS. However, there's a handoff between the ThinApp package and its isolation mechanism and those devices, those scanners. Perfect. So implementation, physical or virtual. To this day, it sort of shocks me that I still get asked, can ThinApp work outside of view on physical desktops? And the answer is 100% yes. That's actually what ThinApp was originally intended for, but it can play on both sides. So as you're designing, you're not limited to just the VDI environment or View or Citrix or what have you. ThinApp on SCCM is probably the biggest thing that I deal with. ThinApp, and now with ThinApp Factory, the idea of spitting out MSIs that get integrated into SCCM is probably the biggest use case that we have. ThinApp has a Windows 7 migration strategy. As you heard, in the keynote yesterday, apparently, welcome to 2009. Windows 7 is now, even though they've been saying for years, Windows 7 migrations is now starting to pick up, and we're feeling that. So again, ThinApp, as part of this solution, I want to try and flip another misconception that I've heard a lot of salespeople say ThinApp will alleviate and 100% fix your Windows 7 migration. That's not the case at all. It's more like 60 to 70% successful. So let's be clear. You can take applications, Windows XP applications, and 60 to 70% of the time, you can then package them with ThinApp and run them on Windows 7, 32 and 64-bit environments. So that leaves 30 to 40% of apps that you need to find another way for. Or you know, with some remediation, they can still be ThinApped, but again, it's really comes down to business case. So I'm happy with this number. It's solid. It still is a very strong use case for ThinApp, but again, it's realistic. And it's the trusted advisor answer rather than trying to sell them something. And it's relatively proven. Perfect. Again, physical desktop infrastructure, like an SCCM, one of the things that I deal with is, can you use ThinApp streaming on physical desktops, an SCCM? And the answer is, yeah, you can. I'm not sure you should, right? I had a customer try to tell me that they wanted to use ThinApp streaming for 220,000 physical desktops. And I just kind of shook my head and I said, well, you're already on the LAN. Why not have, I mean, you already have SCCM. You already have the distribution mechanism already in place. We're gonna cut down the time to deployment of your native installed apps by using ThinApp packages, sometimes in half, right? But why would you want to use ThinApp streaming, which then is going to put more of a burden on the network? I'm not to mention if it's a laptop. So again, if it's a laptop and you're trying to do ThinApp streaming, they get on an airplane, they don't have their apps. So again, we need to be logical about some of these solutions, and sometimes people fall in love with a feature. But from a design perspective, you need to rethink that. You need to really be focused on, well, what am I really trying to do here? You know, in ThinApp, it doesn't have to be all one solution. You need to subtly make sure that you're accommodating each of your design criteria. Don't be afraid of third-party tools. I get this a lot where, you know, Liquidware has an interesting ability to fill small gaps at VMware, from whether it be profiles or, you know, an SMB deployment of ThinApp packages, and the assessment piece is really where I think we're focused on. But again, AppSense is actually coming into play as their profile management solution is actually on the cusp of being able to use our APIs to then deploy ThinApp packages as well. You know, they've been aggressively going after that. So, and there's, you know, as ThinApp is maturing, there's more and more companies that are stepping up to integrate with ThinApp. So again, leveraging existing ESD infrastructure. As I said, SCCM is probably one of the tools that I deal with the most. But I've yet to find a tool that we don't integrate with. But it always shocks me how either in a sales or a design or an implementation strategy aspect, people forget that you don't have to throw away your existing tools. You know, customers all the time, I'm talking to them, and they assume that we have to implement Vue to leverage ThinApp, and that's not the case. ThinApp can sort of, you know, ease its way into an existing, you know, infrastructure to maximize ROI. Leverage existing MSI tools like a Flexera Admin Studio. Again, another misconception, a lot of people think that you have to, you know, throw away your existing tools for MSI packaging and only use ThinApp. That's not the case. You know, especially with the idea of the ThinApp factory. You can take a Flexera, package your apps in an MSI that's customized for your enterprise, and then wrap them and package them with the ThinApp factory. Central ThinApp repository can feed multiple deployment strategies. Again, the EUC ecosystem right now of Horizon and Vue and Mirage will all be centrally fed by the ThinApp factory. That is the play. And it's pretty clean, and we're very happy with it. AppLink, AppSync, and in-place update strategies can be integrated with existing ESD solutions. So the next couple of slides, again, quickly, just to review, obviously Vue and ThinApp, that sounds way too salesy. Don't be afraid that ThinApp can integrate with Citrix, as you saw during the keynote yesterday. We're now on the cusp of, you know, managing XenApp with Horizon and deploying ThinApp packages directly to XenApp through Horizon. Really powerful stuff. and then building upon network and storage analysis to increase performance. Again, we're going to be updating a lot of the IP that myself and the other teams have been writing and working towards. So again, lots of good information coming there. Really quick, as far as the ESD, what I want to get to is these three boxes represent ThinApp packages and those core applications as the primary C program files deployment. In-place updates as a .1 get deployed into and right next to core applications. Dependencies, essentially all I'm asking for is a net new folder structure on the user's desktop, either physical or virtual, and you can deploy those dependencies there so that C program files office knows that if it wants Flash or it wants .NET or what have you, it then points to the dependencies folder to obtain and get that app link relationship. Or you can also deploy them on a network share as well, so that in a VDI deployment, the same core storage lineup can actually, you're ThinApping and you're doing the streaming lifecycle to those as well. So you're not, it's one footprint for apps. We're really close to the idea of having package once, deploy to many. However, using those also, the design strategies around app link and in-place updates as well. It's a very powerful story. The EUC application workflow vision, this is quickly as I'm talking about the EUC lifecycle. Obviously, Horizon is in play. How many people know that with Horizon, it's subtle, but the ThinApp management appliance is embedded in the Horizon App Manager piece? A couple people know that. So the one detractor that I hear all the time from a competitive point was that ThinApp didn't have management associated with it for inventory and metering and monitoring. Well, that's where that ThinApp management, it's a Linux-based appliance that is embedded in Horizon, and that gives us that play. So again, and now ThinApp Factory then ties into that to then deploy applications to Horizon, View, SCCM. That becomes your implementation strategy. That's the vision of where we're trying to get to from the EUC. And as you saw yesterday, App Blast is no longer just a feature. It's a platform for numerous capabilities, HTML5 being one of them, but there's a number of other cool strategies that are embedded in that platform, if you will. So at the end of the day, hey, Mr. Customer, what if I told you that 50% of your applications could be packaged using the ThinApp Factory? 30% could be used. I'm in the background building services around this technology. So from an implementation standpoint, going to the customer and saying, okay, I understand you have 1,000 apps. What if 500 could be packaged, in the background and converted using the ThinApp Factory? I'm now going to offer you, and this is from a partner perspective too, services to help you, package 30% of your apps, which leaves 20% to really worry about in the background. And at that point, we have legacy VM options or new software version. That leads to trusted advisor status. So again, VMware, we're really trying to go after logical solutions to your implementation strategies and not just leave 40% of your apps on the table. We're trying to have an entire workflow to provide you real-world answers in a phased approach. Real quickly, if you probably have seen a ThinApp Factory workflow, it's very clean, and it's different from a couple of other solutions that are out there. So you're logging into an Apache web server. The appliance itself is actually imported into vSphere and Virtual Center, at which point you're spinning up workpool VMs. And this is all done through the API. The ThinApp Factory is making this request talking to Virtual Center, spinning up those work pool VMs, at which point individual capture tasks are created. The work is completed. They are stored on the centralized ThinApp repository, at which point those packages, as I said earlier, can be then deployed to view physical virtual desktops. I'm going to have to update this slide and include Mirage. So lots of good play there. Again, it's healthy, and ThinApp Factory, we're very excited at where it sits right in the middle of the entire overall EUC strategy. Key points on the ThinApp Factory, real quick. Critical to the success of the overall EUC strategy, we feel that it's the new front-end GUI interface for ThinApp, so that it's not just intended to be a conversion tool, it's also, you can do manual captures with it as well. It also has the idea to edit the package.ini file along with the registry. So it's a very important tool in this process. And by the way, it's free, which is really cool. So increase the, now I'm getting salesy, sorry about this. Quick shot of some of the IP that I've been creating along with my team. And it is so you can ask your sales folks about it. Some of this is PSO based, but some of it is also available on Partner Central and some of these other areas as well. Cool. Any questions? And apparently this is being recorded, so if you can come up to the mic.
I had a question about sandboxes. I noticed you didn't touch too much on the best practices for managing sandboxes. I wonder if you could address something about in the current environment we see that natively they like to live on the desktop and the user profile. And we've seen that in our environment that's not the best practice. We would ever recommend that we were relocating them to user-based network shares using profile environmental replacements.
Yep, so I think the question is around how to manage ThinApp sandboxes and whether or not to integrate that with persona management tools. I think the politically correct answer is that we're still doing testing as far as view persona and how that affects ThinApp sandboxes. I think some tools affect it differently. Ultimately, I love the idea of taking that sandbox and migrating it off of, again, the ultimate goal is to go to non-persistent disks. But, I think if I had to say, I think view persona is an 80% solution. I've seen some apps that have challenges with when they want to be hard coded in some areas, so the sandbox ends up being, if the minute you try to move it, it gets a little tricky. So I'm not sure if I have an exact answer for you. I think the jury's still out as to whether or not ThinApp sandboxes should be part of view persona or a profile management tool, but it definitely should be migrated off of the desktop, I believe.
Yes, and I was saying that as well. It shouldn't be in any type of management system. It should live on the network.
My goal is that it should be part. It's just our testing it's hit or miss right now. So from a design perspective, I don't feel comfortable telling you definitively either way. So if you give me a card, we'll definitely keep in touch as far as, as that strategy unfolds, from my perspective.
And I had a follow-up question after listening to Aaron Black's presentations. He seems to be satisfied with the hypervisor for ThinApp as it is right now, or has he classified as a hypervisor. Looking at the numbers and your success rates with Windows products at 60 to 70%, with the non-support of 64-bit applications, how do you respond to that as going forward into a market that you seem to be weak in now with the new release of Windows?
I'm not sure I completely understood the question, but my numbers aren't exact science. They're just my enterprise numbers. So again, from a 64-bit perspective, we don't support 64-bit apps yet, but we're quickly approaching that, more than likely by the end of the year. So, and they're not just. So I guess I may have misled you in a sense that when I put up that 60 to 70%, that was the starting point. Some enterprises hit 90, some hit 80. So I just, I try not to play a game with that line in the sand. I just don't want to give you the wrong impression that it's an exact science and it's 100%. So it's really starting and taking baby steps through the assessment, and the success rate is based on, you know, customer to customer, not a definitive line in the sand. So I just refuse to, you know, go into this marketing fluff about all customers will hit 90% of their apps, because I don't know all their apps. A lot of them are homegrown. Even though they're sitting on Windows, the idea of how many homegrown apps that I deal with now is skyrocketing. And at that point, it's very difficult for me to put a percentage on that, because we don't know they exist. There are no numbers on them. Does that make sense?
It does, but I feel that when we look at these presentations going forward and we look at the evolving of the environment, I would have expected there'd be more of a push towards making this product more robust, stronger. The numbers that you would be presenting would be higher compliance, that you're working towards some of the known issues with the product as we've seen it in XP, knowing that you're going into a Windows 7 environment, knowing that there's 64-bit coming and that your competitors already have it, that you would be moving stronger towards getting those holes filled.
I guess I'm confused by that our competitors already have it. That's the line that sort of threw me, because we're constantly adjusting the product, and we're only as good as Windows. So we're decoupling applications, and you know what it comes down to is these apps may have been written in, and I started to allude to it with Office 2010, but these app developers have taken some shortcuts over the last 4 or 5 years where, you know, it's poorly written applications that when you decouple them, we're uncovering some major hiccups. And a lot of people love to blame ThinApp, but at the same point, we're kind of punching a hole in the time-space continuum if you think about it. So I'm honestly okay with these numbers where they are, but we're constantly striving. The next, I'd say ThinApp 5.0, we're really strongly going after 64-bit app support and app compatibility to be more, you know, to hit, I mean, I could put that number at 90% and be comfortable, but that just isn't across the board. I mean, some customers, based on, like I said, these homegrown apps, that's why I feel we need to put that number at 60 or 70%, especially from a Windows 7 migration, because now the apps that we're trying to ThinApp aren't supported on Windows 7. And so at that point, that's where the time-space continuum comes in. I can't turn an apple into a grape, and this is just not going to happen. But people try to blame ThinApp for that, and that's where we try to be very realistic and upfront with people, and that's why I made that number slightly lower.
All right, agreed. Thank you.
No problem. Apparently I'm getting the hook. Thank you.